Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. Today we have an episode entitled Metastatic Faith and the Logic of the Serpent. And we have a special guest from Scotland with us today. His name is Aiden. And Aiden, I'm so excited to have you with us today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good, Dr. Hagen. It's a real honor to be able to speak to you, actually. A real honor.
Oh, I'm delighted to have you here. We'll talk a little bit about your story, but obviously something like the logic of the snake and metastatic. So it's a lot of this negative theology and this kind of crazy head tripping kind of stuff. But I guess that was discussed in the book In Pursuit of the Metaverse, and it is hard for people to get their heads around. But tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
I was, oh gosh, I had a very ragged upbringing. Both my parents, neither of my parents, I should say, were religious in any way. My father is atheist. My mother, I was described as reverent agnosticism, sort of reverence for life, the idea that life is sacred. But that was kind of the beginning and the end of it. I had, as I say, a ragged upbringing, sort of always on the move every few years. So we moved a lot. My father was an electrician. He's retired now. Both my parents are God willing, still alive. And I have a very good relationship with my parents now. It was quite difficult in younger. But my father was a lighthouse keeper in the 1970s when that was still a job. So I grew up at two different lighthouses, sort of 3 years in one place. So from the age of 3 to 6, and then the age 6 to 9, two different Stevenston lighthouses. And that seems normal when you're a child. Anything you're growing up in is just how the world is. So it's only when you're older and you look back, you realize that was pretty strange. That was a strange way to grow up in these coastal wild areas. In one case on a very small island. And he moved around a lot. He eventually ended up exploring alcoholism quite intensively, and he's got into Alcoholics Anonymous and is something. He'll be 20. He's 27 years sober anyway. This last year. But that was partly why he was kind of fleeing from his demons, or falling out with people and fighting, and so we would have to move. Pack everything into boxes and then go. So got a lot of experience of being an outsider and being able to adapt and communicate with lots of different accents and dialects. Because the next big jump was to South Africa. I was 11. We went out to South Africa, and I had a sort of my teenage years were very difficult. My father was getting very difficult at that stage. There was a lot of lying, and I became very allergic to lies. So truth became really, really important to me, as in like not just something intellectually important, but physically almost. I could physically feel the difference between what's true and what's a lie. And so that pursuit of truth became, it took precedence, almost in reaction to my father's descent into lying for no reason, lying for the sake of lying when he knew that I would know he was lying, that kind of thing. And I had to go into the South African Army. I had 2 years of national service. It was the dying days of apartheid at the end of the 1980s. So a country was kind of, the old way was coming apart, and the new way, which was pretty chaotic, it was a birth in chaos of and a lot of disintegration, and that disintegration was continued. So my exposure to religion, I had, in terms of religious formation, I had two best friends, one in Scotland and then one in high school in South Africa, who were the sons of ministers. And so I attended things like Sunday school. It's very Protestant, very kind of Church of Scotland, and then in South Africa it would be Anglican, quite Calvinist. And then the real religion that had the control in South Africa was the Dutch Reformed church, and that was really Calvinist, really intensively the real deal, like pure tulip, the five principles, and is very harsh, so very easy to reject and rebel against for me, and the idea as well that was all there really was to Christianity. I read C.S. Lewis, I read Tolkien, and I read a few others in my sort of early teens and onwards. And so I had this exposure. I remember reading C.S. Lewis and thinking, I don't disagree with anything that's here. This is, but it didn't match with what I was being told. There were teachers who would get up and read from the Bible, and it was all very harsh. It was all very performative as well. It wasn't real. It wasn't what they were living. It wasn't, the words and the things read out had no connection to the way that they were as people, and the way that they treated other people, the way that they lived their lives. It was as though religion was in one circle and your life was over here, and you were religious by maintaining this strange kind of bridge between the two. But you didn't go pursuing anything. There was nothing to find there. It was just something you said. And then South Africa was essentially that incarnate in its government and in its military too. So stop me if you want me to.
So, like at this time of your life, maybe some of the religions in your head, not really in your heart. It's not there at the home, but you were looking for truth. What would ring true to you? Like some sense of beauty, like music or art? And where did you find a sense of truth?
Well, I found none, increasingly less and less, and went into a crisis while in the army, because of the lack of it, because of the inauthenticity of everything as I experienced it. I mean, part of the problem was my home life was intolerable, and then I was in a military base, and it was intolerable too, and I couldn't support what the whole structure was there to maintain. And I really went into a downward spiral, so that in pursuit of anything, I couldn't find anything. And I had a religious experience in the army, of going from essentially a spiral into kind of suicidal despair at the lack of anything real and true that I could genuinely take hold of and have it be part of me and I be part of it. And I had an experience that took a matter of minutes. It was in a 20-minute bus journey from the base to where I was working in my military role. And I got on the bus on one side, and I was in this incredibly bleak state. I went into kind of internal apocalypse. Suspended over a kind of abyss. The next thing to happen was my destruction, and with my head against the window. And when I got out of the bus on the other side, I was completely changed. And in that experience, I basically came to the end of like a big kind of coming together of a lot of poison, a lot of toxicity, a lot of hatred and anger and self-loathing. And so this was at the age of 19. I had an experience of surrendering. I don't know if I will go into the personal detail, because perhaps it's helpful. I don't tend to tell very many people about this. I came to the end, right? So the end of everything, of mine, everything in my life. And I was very much pointing the finger at the emptiness of everything. But then it did occur to me, how am I in this privileged position of able to have the hand that's full of meaning that says everything is meaningless? How is that a meaningful statement, to say that this is all meaningless? I couldn't see how that was any more meaningful than all the meaninglessness. If everything was meaningless, then so was the statement that all of that was. And then I began to have this sense of there might be another way. And I kind of had a voice saying that I interacted with a voice. to say, I could take another way, I could pick another way in life. And I could take a way that makes me happy, because I was really not happy at that time. And I didn't want to do that. So I battled to hold on to all of the hatred and everything, but that was down into the destruction. Or I let it all go, which I really didn't want to do, because who's going to do all the accusing? Who's going to do the righteous finger pointing? And in the end, I said, all right then. I said, oh, all right then. And I let go. And it was as though I was taken, up. So this had been like weighted to help me out of this terrible state. And the next thing to happen was an experience of meeting Jesus. And I didn't like I didn't like the name Jesus then, but I had a very real experience. He didn't say anything. It was me looking at him and him looking at me, and I was on the receiving end of mercy, which I hadn't believed in up until that point. And I had about 6 months of walking around in a completely changed state of experiencing love, and I wrote in my notebook, I saw Christ as the Christians see him, and because up until that point, that's not how I saw. I didn't see any of that. That's not what it looked like to me. It looked like a cop-out. It looked like something that cowards hid behind as well, an excuse for all kinds of weakness, nothing that I liked. I had a kind of, I suppose, I would say as a Nietzschean kind of view of the whole thing. And that changed everything. The problem was, because I was coming from the outside, that didn't mean go to the Catholic Church, go from there. And, if I'd done that, I feel like that would have been the sensible, but there was nothing telling me that's the way. I was on the outside, and I was very aware of all of the black legends. I believed the black legends about the church, and also the church not helping itself in terms of the behavior of the hierarchy and so on, but very much an outsider, and had no experience to Catholicism. I probably should underscore that point, that my father was told when he was in his teens, my grandparents, his parents, were very, very Protestant and very, very orange and very Masonic. And they said, you can bring an African girl home, you can bring a Chinese girl, you can bring German, French, it doesn't matter who, but don't you dare bring a Catholic girl into this house. That's how intensely anti-Catholic they were. So
now, who were these people that
my grandparents?
Okay, they that were the pastors.
They weren't actually pastors. They were Masonic, and they were orange, and they were very involved in their Protestant church.
Would you call them Calvinist?
I don't know if would have been Church of Scotland.
Were they Presbyterian? Were they Scottish?
Yes, it would have been Scottish Presbyterian.
Okay.
Not the hardcore free church kind of thing. Who are the ultra Calvinists in Scotland? They're known as the Wee Frees here, and they're the ultra Calvinists in Scotland. But they took it seriously as a kind of badge. Rather, it's more of a
their hatred toward Catholicism actually defined themselves.
Yeah, that's a big thing in the west of Scotland, and it's kind of an import from Ireland, the struggles of Ireland. But I mean, Scotland's had its own its own history of anti-Catholicism, which was incredibly strong. I mean, to the point of if you go back hundreds of years, the murdering the priests who were caught saying mass, in the most horrible ways.
So in some cases, almost worse than the English in some ways.
Well, I think the same kinds of things went on down there, but
same idea.
Yeah, same idea, and quick for Scotland, because Scotland was holding on and remaining Catholic, and you had what was happening in England, and they were consolidating that, and then it was this kind of force for Scotland. And there's some very interesting documents about the holdouts. Interestingly, Kilwinning, which is Lodge Zero for the Masons, but Kilwinning Abbey, and there was a real stronghold in Ayrshire. I'm in Ayrshire in Scotland, this kind of west coast. There was a real Catholic stronghold there, and the Knox described it as, as nests. He said to pull down their nests, which was the Abbey and various other abbeys down there, and to really stamp it out with violence, and the hatred is intense. I didn't really understand it coming back from South Africa. I didn't really understand why the dominant religious force would still have this anti-Catholic hatred. I mean, really intense hatred. So that isn't the only reason, but it was just kind of coming from there. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't something that I would have thought of doing.
Some of it is this sense of this rise of nationalism, or it seems to be more this international faith rather than it goes against the Scottish ethos in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, there was a strong Catholic presence in the national independence movement as an idea of going back to the kind of Jacobite cause, which was, the Stuart Kings, and that was Catholic monarchies, and to be united with Europe. And I always imagined like it would have been a very different world history if Scotland had remained Catholic and had in fact gone the other way, and the Protestant monarchy had fallen, because you wouldn't have had this dynamic happen. Anyway, that's a counterfactual, isn't it?
Yeah. And so you're 19. You had a Christian conversion. Did it stick, or would you not call it Christian?
Well, I didn't at the time. I didn't. I've talked to a priest about it, and he said that sounds like you had a moral conversion and not a spiritual conversion.
Like you were giving it up to the universe, or this kind of.
I didn't know who I was giving up to. I didn't know I was gonna meet. I didn't know that was going to be the experience, and I didn't know I should have just taken the shortcut. I should have just gone straight to him, and I didn't know that I would find him in the Eucharist. I didn't know that he was waiting for me there. And so this kind of search through all the mystical traditions, because I'd had this experience that I couldn't deny of the everything changed. 1 minute everything's one way, now everything is different.
But I know got spiritual, and so that was part of this mystical journey that you now embarked upon.
I would say I got ridiculously so. That's why I wear the metastatic faith. Why it appealed to me to potentially talk about that today. The metastatic faith. I went away into that. Whereas everything you've described so well about the metaxy and that tension and you have to remain there. The push for the draw of the sort of purely spiritual, this spiritualization of everything, is like to obtain a premature entry into heaven, before you die, so that you can be in that state all the time, so that it will somehow you will may as well say that for those who've maybe not read the book or didn't dwell on that part where Vogelin splits the Gnostic effects. Yeah.
He's talking about the In Pursuit of the Metaverse. Please go on, Aiden.
Yeah, he splits it into the expansion of the immanent frame. So you collapse the transcendent reality of eternal forms into the immanent frame, just the material, everyday world of things that we live in. And then it's all about that. And that's where this dynamic of control and a lot of the political games is in this expansion of that immanent, at the expense of anything transcendent. And the world really has gone down that road. There's a juggernaut that's traveling in that way now. But there is also a huge amount of this other side of it, which is the metastatic faith, as Vogelin described it, which is the reverse dynamic. You take the immanent frame, you take the world of things, into the transcendent reality, or you enter the transcendent reality at the expense of the immanent frame. You're basically getting rid of the world. It's very much much more the classical Gnostic heresy of being world denying, and so that's kind of like another, the view from Gnosticism of the Catholic Church is well, it isn't this purely spiritual thing, it's not this pure perfect thing. So they would ally with in spirit with, say, the Cathars, the Albigensian heresy, and say, look at these poor, and then this is just another mark against any possible point in favor of the Catholic Church being, what it claims to be, and what it is, what it is. So the problem with the metastatic faith is just how compelling it is and how self-reinforcing the state is. So once you're in it, why do you want to get out of it? It draws you in more and more and more, just like with the expansion of the immanent realm. There's more and more. There's no end to it. It'll just keep running and running until something stops it. But according to its own logic, it'll just keep running. And the same is true for the for this kind of heavenly version of the and this is where
the metastatic faith we would call more of the classic Gnosticism, or denial of the physical
denial
and
of the
just
world,
living in an ascended world.
denial of the body, denial of, or at least of their meaning. So it's how you end up with. It's what you find. So certainly what I find in the perennial philosophy. So the perennial philosophy that's the first kind of thing that I read that made sense to me. It was the Aldous Huxley version of the perennial philosophy. This idea of a Sophia perennis, this wisdom that's always present in all the different traditions and paths in history. It's come through time and it's always been there. To me now, I can see that as the kind of, I think of that as the serpent gnosis, the serpent's knowledge that it provides. That's and so everything outside the church, this is how it now seems very clear to me now. All of the other spiritual traditions that are available, they can all be integrated with each other fairly easily through this negation and through what happens with the negation, because it doesn't remain in a kind of void state. In the void state, in the negation state, you have this light, you have this experience of illumination, and that is profoundly compelling, it's powerful. And once you've started, why would you stop? So all of the spiritual traditions that are outside the church are essentially have this dynamic in them. Particularly in the East, you find this negation, this idea of the void, is in Buddhism. Nirvana is cessation, but you have this emphasis on the void in these various other developed Buddhisms. You have it in Taoism. I got really into Taoism in my early 20s, because one of the first things I read after reading Aldous Huxley and all the quotes from all the different mystics, and this idea that you could have a synthesis of all the mystical exponents of like, he had an idea of a highest common factor of religions, and that you could kind of distill this essence, and then an elite, a kind of spiritual elite, could have this essence and not need to bother with the
it's very Freemasonic when you think about it, the synthesis of everything, and it is part of the New World Project. Joseph Campbell was being pushed heavily in the 1980s, this idea that there's this common thread. We might get onto this in a moment, but Tomberg you have read, and yes. I think most people see the word, what's the word in here? Hermetic tarot cards.
Run a mile.
And they just tell you to stay away, and they've never actually read it. I don't recommend it to anybody. It sounds like you came from that background. I know someone like Wolfgang Smith, who's a famous mathematician, physicist, traditional Catholic. He was a perennialist, and later in life, he was asked, I think he was in his late 80s, he was asked, about some of the classic French and Sufi people that he had sort of collaborated with. And he made a distinction that for him, what was fundamental, he played around with that school, but the incarnation, the transcendent God coming into our reality, shattered the whole concept of what we call real and created a whole new frame of reference. And he said most of these other perennialists in the East or otherwise, they literally don't even have a category in their brain for something like this. So part of me coming toward the Catholic Church was also, I realized that every Gnostic sect couldn't keep the balance between the transcendent and the immanent. And Protestants don't really give Catholics credit for anything. Oh, they gave us the Trinity. They got that right. They don't even really acknowledge that they gave the canon of Scripture. But these heresies had to be rooted out. Otherwise, Christianity as such, with the balance of reality wouldn't have survived itself. So talk a little bit about, did you get like spiritually, I mean, some people are in this for years and years and years. We'll just roughly call it the New Age. Did you get something spiritually out of it?
In that metastatic way, in that ongoing, it's not the same thing. When you say spiritually, it's not the same thing as happens in the church. Because I could perhaps say, in contrast to now, coming to the church is coming into something stops, something settles, something's grounded.
Being.
Yeah. Being.
As opposed to becoming.
Exactly. So it's the other way is this somehow is endless becoming, even though it's casting the phenomena that are happening as in some sense illusory, because that's the idea, is that the world is a type of illusion. It's arising out of some kind of ignorance, and you're just dealing with these phenomena while you have to deal with them until such time as you perfectly purify and dissolve into the light, and disappear. So it's that constant, that's the search, is how can I perfectly do this? Whereas not having to do that, that's the relief of that is more than I can say. So coming into the church and having all that stop, having that crushed, let's say, having the head of the serpent be crushed, it's done. That's not happening. We're not going on that. We're not doing that. There's just this. You're just going to have this incredibly simple, incredibly humble. There's not going to be all of this magical stuff, because as you're saying as well, the idea of the Incarnation, and I think it's Vogelin again, the idea of de-divinizing the world. Like prior to the Incarnation, the experience of both the transcendent and the immanent is like they're joined, and so people don't even question it. Whereas the divinity is entirely in Christ, and then the world is de-divinized, and so all of the little divinities lose all their power insofar as they're not in communion with Christ, and so far as they're not, they've got no play to make unless pagans try to bring. But even so, they're not going to they have actually no power in reality anymore. So
the serpent comes to the garden. And this is before man's fallen state. And the serpent comes to the garden, and Adam and Eve were in God's being. And he whispers sort of a promise. And it's an illusory promise. And that's what kind of keeps reality going, or this artificial reality of chasing this. And it's really, and it sounds like a tall claim, but everything outside the church is chasing this snake to some degree or another. They're in the process of becoming something.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think the snake has got them and is invisibly wrapped around, and it's circulating, and they're going round and round. But the snake has basically got everything that's not in Christ. I think it's that stark, actually. Everything that's not in his church is wrapped around by the snake. And
it's
that's why
bold claim. It is, but that's what Catholicism is. We have it when we keep Christ's crucified body on the cross. We don't have the cross without the body. We don't have Christ without the cross without Christ. And of course, in the Mass, when heaven and earth come together in the sacrifice of Christ and our own sacrifice meet. And that in our fallen state is as perfect as it gets. And that's the kind of state we want to remain in. seems like we do our rosary and we cause, when we meditate, it's a time of a sort of micro moment when we try to just be. And we know in the modern world, it's so difficult, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that the world is designed to do the opposite in a way. The world
Exactly.
is this rush of the opposite, going somewhere, which is, it's very frightening when you see where it's going. And that's the kind of thing that can wake people up if they see, hang on, this is not good, and it's not going anywhere good. So in a way, it's like retracing your steps to, where did you last have functioning civilization, and actually then realizing everything that's good about yourself, everything that you value about your life, has come from that. Has been generated by that.
Yeah.
And that's what's being broken apart. So, but the thing I wanted to just add about the de-divinization is that people know this, and a lot of the blame gets laid in many ways correctly with modern science, the rise of this idea that it's disenchanted the world, and then what our task is to kind of re-enchant it.
Okay.
And that's a real mistake. Yeah.
It's a what?
Yeah, a real mistake. A mistake
Okay.
to think that our role is to re-enchant the world, because that's how you end up back in this kind of metastatic thing going on. Our role is not to re-enchant that. That's where you end up tangling with the snakes.
I agree. So in Christendom, although the world was never perfect, all the institutions, social, economic, cultural institutions, recognizing Christ as the King, all power and authority, and it was an attempt to create not just society, but an empire in a state of being. And because it's called the Dark Ages and stuff like that, we can't see it in terms of its balance. And that's, I think, where it was really quite an achievement. So everything since then, when man and his aspirations are replacing God with the Renaissance and humanism, it's just this endless cycle. So whether or not we're chasing something material or we're trying to chase something spiritual, we're still on a sort of treadmill of becoming. And the last thing people would probably think about is to go into reality traditionally understood by the church and the remnants that we have still here with us. And I agree, there is this idea. So paganism was atrophying. With the incarnation of Christ, it had nothing. It was just folding apart. And that needed to be necessary to build the church and to build this empire of being. And now it's reversed, and the church is becoming atrophied, and the ancient paganism now has a revitalization. And it was only possible, I think, because the restraining power is bringing that back. And so that's kind of where we're at now. But let's pick up with your story a little bit. So you're in your 20s and into your 30s, and you're doing, whether it's some Eastern things or you're reading some of the continental sort of
20s is the like, there's a few big mistakes, or they look, in retrospect. And one was a text called A Course in Miracles, which I picked up, I think I was 20. I think I was 20.
Miriam Williams.
Well, yeah, she's inspired by, she's a Course in Miracles person. It's had a huge impact, although it's kind of in its own thing. A lot of people still haven't heard of it. It's a huge book. It's purports to be a channeled text, and the channeler, the scribe, was a woman called Helen Schuckman, a Jewish lady, and a psychiatrist, I think, psychologist or psychiatrist. And she was working with a guy, her boss, William Thetford. And there's a very strange overlap. Who knows how much? No one's ever been able to find out any more than this very interesting overlap for sort of Dr. Deep State theme with William Thetford, that he worked for Project Bluebird of MK Ultra. Supposedly he was doing psychological profiling for Project Bluebird, And this was in the 70s, so this was at least when the text was being scribed. That's certainly a mark against it. And another mark that is so powerfully against it is that Helen Schucman herself. There's a description of her, it was a priest, Father Groschel, who visited her on numerous occasions in her last years, and he described her last 2 years as being a black hole of rage and depression, and she cursed the book and in the most foul language imaginable, apparently, and said it was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and all the rest of it. The book purports to be written by Jesus. The voice purports to be a correction, of Christianity and of all the misunderstandings. And so I don't know how much you want me to go into it, but there's 3 parts to it, and there's a workbook, and it takes a year, and it's all meditation. There's a text which sets out a theoretical thing, and there's what's called a manual for teachers. And so it's a Course in Miracles. So this is where I went in trying to find Jesus, trying to get that connection, having met him, and having wanting more.
Know, were you using the name? Were you looking for fulfillment, or were you specifically on a road to Jesus?
I was wanting to do the metastatic faith thing where I could be like him, and I could basically join it with him in what I imagined was this, from a metastatic perspective, how to help the world. So my misguided approach was, if I keep getting into this light heaven only kind of state, the more I do that and the better I do that, the more it'll help the state of the world. And its emphasis is on forgiveness and things like that. It doesn't give itself away. It's actually, it leads you into this never-ending pursuit. This never-ending.
And also the logic of the serpent. That's kind of the Gnostic appeal. It's going to take a lot of elements of reality and just kind of have you miss that little critical part. And from that little bit, it can move you over here and then potentially over here. So Gnosticism, and this is what people have to understand, because it's really something that almost can't be defined. It's a shapeshifter over time, and it can almost take opposite appearances. But what it is, it's a snake. It's sneaky. And it sounds, did God really say that? And this is another route. It might be better. But you knew you weren't in the institution. You knew you weren't operating in an institutional church. Is that right?
Yeah. And I did go, I went to various churches to kind of challenge, and I would get into arguments of goodwill, but based on looking for the true church, and looking for.
Are you in your 20s now?
Yeah, in my 20s.
Would you have understood at that time? Because I didn't even have categories when I was younger. Not until I think I was touched by grace could I even kind of explore these categories. But I always knew something was a little off with Calvinism. And part of this idea, if these most hideous things happen to human beings, they don't like to say it because it's a hard teaching, but God wills all this torture and death and so forth. So in a sense, that's the God you're worshiping that would will this kind of thing on something.
Yeah.
And would you have been able to pick up that aspect of Calvinism and used it as an excuse not to go into that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I said if God was of that type, then he was a moral monster, and it would be our duty to oppose him. It would be like a spiritual duty to. But that's how you end up that fits and dovetails with the Gnostic view that the world is essentially a fallen thing created by a demiurge. This isn't the real thing. This isn't the real life. That kind of idea. So that was really easy to deny. But that's also that denial and the idea that, in a sense, all the versions of Christianity are just these fallen versions. Christianity starts from a really high place and falls to a very low place. That's how it looked to me for years, actually. And I wouldn't have. Yeah, I wanted, it was DIY, you know, it was like you
Yeah,
gotta do
and
it
that's
yourself.
yeah, and yeah, and it's modern in that sense, right? When something's always about to improve, I'm going to get on the next innovation. But I'm thinking out loud, like whether it's the church fathers in the second, third century, or people engaged in the monastic life, there's even if they're just spending all day praying, they're doing it within the mystical body of Christ, achieving a particular function. When we kind of just do our own thing on the dance floor out here, it's kind of more we're being, I think, um, used by the serpent in that case.
I really think so. The thing that over years, as a kind of um, approached a completely different perspective over a length of time, one of the things is the entering in by the door rather than climbing in another way. It's in John, um, and it's the idea that getting, you know, entering the sheepfold, coming in by another route, and it
Yeah.
was in it was in it's about the true shepherd and the flock. And
That's always the logic of the serpent from the beginning. Do it this way. Humanism, and because the Renaissance came in so celebrated, instead of, you go through a museum, instead of seeing all these stiff characters, you're seeing this luscious, seductive, beautiful, the possibilities of man, if we could just recapture some of the best elements of the ancient world, would. And then with the advent of science and reason being celebrated as the be all and end all, it does seem like a good competitor to just sitting back and having faith for some people. But that's the way of the serpent. And what it's really doing is replacing God with man, when it comes right down to it. So the whole modern project, in that sense, it's luciferian, it's of the serpent. And so, I mean, we always have to realize this is when we operate in the modern world. And you just told me a moment ago, social media, it's why it's toxic. It's always getting you to spin around within the devices of modernity. And it is just something we need to at least be able to identify what it is, and finding this place of being, right? And
yeah.
I don't know if that's going to be part of your story right here. Like what part of your life did you start getting into more things like the Tomberg and things like that?
Tomberg was late because I mean I converted in a I'm that's why whatever I say about the church, take with a pinch of salt. I'm basically only what 2.5 years old as a Catholic,
Oh, me too.
and so I came in 2022, and that was on the heels of reading Tomberg. And I was saying to you before, I don't think I would have been able to make the jump without reading Tomberg, and I
It really helped me to
don't
become Catholic.
recommend Tomberg to anyone, but I think anyone with my background, there's so many elements that it just lays bare. It shows you kind of the supernatural reality of the church in a way, in the Incarnation, and in between, on so many aspects, on the role of the papacy. It just things just fell into place on reading that, and I was reading that in the wake of.
We must have been reading it at the same time.
I was reading in the wake of having nearly died. I did something very foolish, and I ended up with pneumonia. And so recovering from pneumonia, I've got so many books, it's absurd. I do suffer from a kind of bibliomania. I get books and think I want to read that at some point, and then I do. Every now and then there'll be one, and I'll go and I'll get it, and I finally read it after all these years. It's been sitting there, and that was one I'd had it since like 2010 or something, and I thought, right, okay, I'm gonna, in this state of recovery, which took a while. I'm going to read it. So it was in this, I was really slowed down, and I read every word. It couldn't have got a more slowed down reader than me.
Which are you talking about, Tomberg right now?
Meditations on the
Oh,
Tarot. Yeah.
it's exhausting.
Yeah. I found it, I was just in the most receptive state I could possibly have been in, this recuperating state. And just to see through all the different kind of levels that he presents. And that was what kind of clinched it, because prior to that, I'd been drawn. I go back to like 2008. It's 2007, 2008. I read this other book that I can't recommend to anyone, René Guénon. I read a couple of Guénon, and I got to.
Yeah, he was a correspondent with Wolfgang Smith, and yeah, I've played with that a little bit.
he becomes a Sufi and all of that. But that had a huge impact on me. It was a dark impact, though. It shocked the modernity, all of the modern aspect I just took for granted. Reading that book is like a terrible corrective. I ended up feeling quite frightened about the state of the world, all the things I'd take, all of my complacency, that was gone. And I would say that book was a struggle to recover from that book. And I think I maybe mentioned in a message to you the three most impactful texts are that one, the reign outside of scripture, the reign of quantity, and the signs of the times, Tomberg's book, and then the Metaverse, just because what I've been putting together since my 20s, the other aspect is trying to write this sort of book, after the military, I said, I'm going to work out what's really going on. That was my kind of coming out of this craziness, having had this experience. The world is not what I thought it was. I'd been sitting in judgment over it. Now I know there's far, far more going on than I imagined. I'm going to work out what's going on. So that's been a project of 30 odd years to try to, and I started with geocentrism, and I went on. It kind of built. I thought I was going to do a whole book on just the structure.
You are a geocentrist, right?
I am a geocentrist. I am a geocentrist. Yes.
Okay.
The geocentric. Yeah.
Yeah. What, and especially in a Tomberg sense, because it's holding the balance together. So you read a lot of perennial stuff over the years.
Yeah, that was the shock. And then I was drawn, I thought Eastern Orthodox doesn't have the papacy, doesn't have the, seems to have kept its integrity with regard to the liturgy. I was drawn, I think I mentioned that, and there was Telegram kind of little conversation. I was drawn by the energies, specifically, the sort of Palamas, essence energy distinction, and the idea of the uncreated energies of God. That appealed to me immensely. You go into the uncreated, and there are these energies. Yeah, so I can fit that.
A lot of this stuff is very heady. Do you miss not reading all this heady stuff anymore?
The perennialist. No, I don't.
It's mystical, and that's what's hard for people. So you were actually able to understand the Metaverse book. I think a lot of people are going to, it's a tricky concept to think about being, and like evil is a sense just the negation of being. It's nothing, but yet you can pull a counterfeit reality out of nothing. It's so difficult to explain that, right? Apophatic negation of being. But you were able to get it and understand it, and it clicked for you somehow.
It clicked in like sitting reading it saying, it feels like this was written for me. I was wondering who else is out there reading this, feeling like this has been written for me. And even more than that, I would say I'd already come into the church before reading Metaverse, and I'd already gained so much. But it was reading, and this is only this year, so I hadn't discovered your channel or anything until just this year. But the reading the role, the mediating role, just the idea of how the mediation works in terms of the icons and the symbols, and that they're perform this mediating role, so that when I went in to mass, and it was Easter, it was all like I'd gone through Lent and everything, and I'd taken time off YouTube, and I wasn't watching anything anywhere, no digital stuff. I had, that was my Lent. It was just, I got it. That was the light switch. Was like everything is mediating reality to me. Every little aspect of it, and to understand that even the most crudely made crucifix or icon of any kind is performing this mediating role. It is not the reality. There's all of this Protestant idea that the Catholics are bowing down before idols and everything. That's not what's happening with the mediating role of. So it was, yeah. I mean,
we were. I had already decided to become Catholic, and I read some parts, especially exploring the egregore a few years back. And then I was on a track to become Catholic. And so Will and I made a project of really digging into Tomberg at another level. But we found that material on the icon, and it really gave another depth. I was already on my road to becoming Catholic, but that's what every Protestant says. We don't need the mediation. And I don't think they miss the construction of reality when they say that. That's why an idea like the Blessed Mother or the saints mean nothing to them, much less the idea of the icon. And we found that through like there's a lot of Marxism in what we're using, but a lot of the Marxism will, because it shows you back a lens from another perspective of the Catholic reality. And so that idea of, especially from the Orthodox material dealing with the historical concept of the icon, was really eye-opening to me.
Well, the Jean Baudrillard stages of how you approach the simulacrum, and the realization that you can reverse those stages is just the most astonishing. It's a brilliant use, because obviously Baudrillard himself believed that this was an inevitable process. You know, it's just this, here we go, we're going into this lie that you can't really get out. You just sort of make your peace with it. Just like the Negri and, you know, the Empire guys that you
Right.
drew from quite a bit. They basically say, got to embrace the fact that we're apes and we're going to be cybernated and all of that. So, but the idea that you can reverse those stages, that was kind of why it worked out. That the serpent dismisses the kingdom and denies the sacraments, denies the efficacy of denies all of that mediation, that it's even possible.
So, I mean, because I didn't get a chance to, you know, I kind of thought through the dissension. So work with me here, because part of it is, in the modern world, we lost that porousness that left us open to the transcendent. And the thinker Charles Taylor, that wrote this seminal book, his Harvard Press 2007, would say, we're in the modern world, we're no longer porous, the world is no longer enchanted, forget about it. So even though he's coming from a historical perspective, he's saying something similar to the Marxists. And in my head the whole time, so you go with it, because I wasn't where I'm going with the book, but returning to the bosom of the church, right? We can reverse this, the direction of the snake. What are some ideas you'd have for that?
Well, I mean, for us, for the position that we find ourselves in, where they're creating this self-referential circle, this self-referential reality, because you have the descent from the sacramental economy, or sacrum imperium, and then into the maleficent stage, where the assumption is that the icon, the image in the sacramental economy, it's functioning, it's doing what it is. It is what it does. You know, it
literally mediates,
symbolize it. Yeah, it affects what it represents, and so we simply engage. When you get the next stage down, obviously this Maleficence coming in. I find his language so interesting that he recognizes that it's maleficent, that it's an evil moon. It's then the assumption that the icon is covering up the reality. The image is somehow concealing something and maybe distorting it in some way, so you can't trust it. So in order to get the real reality, you've got to get rid of that. So that's where the iconoclasm comes in. And then you're going to lay hold of the real reality. Of course, they didn't do that. They didn't lay hold of any reality. They just strip everything out. And then it goes down to now the images. This is where it's what's the next one called? The age of, it's before you get to the simulacrum, sorcery. It's the circle, or the sorcerer's circle. And so now the signs refer to other signs. You know, every image is a derivation of another image, and the idea of spin, and this is how we control things in mass communication. We can use the circle to spin things the way we want them to be. Rather, there is a way that they are. The idea is that there's an image there, but the image is actually not the reality. So it covers up an absence of reality. So that absence is the thing. And then the image just uses the absence and does whatever it wants really with it. The sorcerers, the spin doctors do their thing. And then the
Yeah.
last one is there is no reality. There is no reality. There is just simulacrum, which is an absolute terrifying prospect. So the reversal of that is we deny all self-referential circles. Like, it's absurd. I think you point out in the book it can't actually be true, because in order to even exist, it has to be rooted in being. There has to be. If there's no being, it's gone. So it can't cut itself off so completely from reality. So it's a delusion that it's a possibility to even accomplish. It can't be done, which is why it will fail. It will fail because it can't be done. There's always going to be a gap that it can't complete. And that's what you find in the metastatic faith thing. There's always a gap. It's got to keep going.
Because it's
Never
a
be.
parasitical process.
Yeah, precisely. So
It
that's
can't be its own thing.
Yeah.
That's part of this bizarreness of immanence. Well, you know what? We're going to do that in part 2. I am so impressed, Aiden, with your understanding of this. Wow, you really track that well. We're going to break this into part 2 now, everybody. So we're going to pick up Aiden again in just a moment on locals. So if you want to catch more of this, please hop over there.